All right, welcome to Whitley Penn Talks. My name is John Williamson. I'm a risk advisory partner at Whitley Penn, located in the Dallas office. With me is Jesus Vega, an IT audit manager in our practice. Today we want to talk to you about cybersecurity, the threat landscape. In particular, we're all aware that the pandemic has significantly impacted the way that we've all done business in 2020. Well, that's also impacted the cyber threat landscape and how we're approaching cybersecurity at large. So we're going to walk through a few things today, one of which will be what things looked like before the pandemic, how that changed things, how we're all adapting. And in particular, I think now we're in a fairly distributed work from home model, but we're also kind of at a hybrid too, right? Because many of us are working at the office, but many of us are still working at home. So that will present some unique challenges for IT departments and for those that are in the practice of cybersecurity. So first, let's walk through a few things, one of which is what things looked like pre-pandemic. In 2019, Jesus and I, we're in our cybersecurity consulting practice. We do a lot of SOC 2 reports. We deal with information security matters quite a bit with our clients. And what we saw were a few things, a few trends that I think would probably be interesting for you to think about. One of which is a decline in a particular type of malware. I'm going to highlight two things for you, Trojans and RAM scrapers. Now it's a type of malware, think of a virus that's installed locally on a machine, and these kinds of malware are usually targeted towards data stored on devices. In fact, a RAM scraper, if you think about this kind of malware, it's a type of malware that actually pulls data off of the random active memory of a local device. It was a common type of attack in the early part of the 2010s. So many of you may be familiar with the target attack. It was a primary method to steal credit card data from retailers. Well, we're seeing a general decline in these kinds of attacks, and we saw a corresponding increase and some other kinds of attacks, one of which is ransomware. I think we're all very familiar with that. Ransomware was on the uptick in 2019. The idea here is that it's an attack that locks you out of your data. You pay a ransom to the perpetrator to unlock the data and gain access back to your machine. And then also we've seen a huge, significant increase in phishing attacks. And this has been a trend that we've seen just for years and years. And I think the idea here is that it's a volume game. Cyber criminals, they send thousands of emails a day. All they have to do is just trick one person into clicking the link or opening a document that downloads malware, and it's been by far a very profitable venture for them. So we've seen these kinds of attacks increasing over time. Well, what happened in 2020? Well, the pandemic hit, right? And so this means then that most of us began working from home in March and April of 2020. In fact, I think many economic bureaus, the Department of Labor indicated that 88% of companies throughout the U.S. encourage their employees to begin working from home. So Jesus, what I'd like to ask you and get your thoughts on here, that impacted the way that we worked. Our digital footprint expanded significantly. So with all of us working in from home, how does that change the technology infrastructure, our approach to how we're managing several remote access points? What are some things that changed in March and April of this year that's still persistent today?
Hi, John. Thanks for this subject. I think it's a good subject to discuss with our audience. And the answer to your question is that as we've gone to a work from home scenario, what the majority of companies are experiencing is how to accommodate all the different satellite nodes of work from home that has converted into part of their environment. When you're talking about having a setup at home, having VPN back to the office and whatnot, you still have to account for all the extra devices that are out there. When you are talking about being in an office scenario, you have your standard stack of technology. You have your perimeter firewall, you have your email filters that protect everything that is coming in. You have centralized tools to manage antivirus and all that kind of stuff. But when you go to home, you might have the email protection on your corporate email, but you don't have protection on the personal email that is coming into that company-owned workstation. You might have somebody who bought a microphone and a camera for all those virtual conferences that are happening. But the question is, did they change the administrator password? Or do we have all these internet-connected devices that are running under the default credentials? So that's the new reality that a lot of companies are facing, is we have an expanded office with, depending on the number of employees, those are the satellite nodes.
So Jesus, you've mentioned this a couple of times, which is a really fancy IT term that many of us are not familiar with, including myself. So satellite node, can you enlighten us? What does that mean?
So satellite node, from the traditional infrastructure that we had pre-COVID, you had an office, which was your primary location, and you had a node location, which is a smaller separate office, part of your environment. That office usually had, let's say the HR department was a separate satellite node. But now you have a node per person, because that person is going home using their internet connection to establish a connection back to the office. There's most likely technology in place to protect that connection, such as VPN, and the computer probably does have antivirus and the best practice protection on it. However, what else is on that computer? Like, the biggest concern that I have right now as we go home and work from our home office is the peripherals that we have installed on top of our computers. Printers, webcams, microphones. Some of us get fancy and have like high-end equipment, but they still have to be set up. They still have default credentials. So regardless of the type of technology, you're adding complexity to your environment by those satellite offices.
So maybe you can help expand on this too, Jesus. So you're bringing up the idea of peripherals that we normally don't think about, right? We normally think about our primary personal computer or laptop as being the main gateway or mechanism that a cyber criminal might take advantage of to attack us. But you just brought up printers and other peripherals. So maybe you can explain, how is that a risk area? What can a cyber criminal do to exploit or take advantage of peripherals or other devices on a home network?
And the home network, really, when it comes down to those devices, it comes down to configuration. If you buy a IP camera, connect it to the internet, and don't follow the instructions to configure it properly, and all of a sudden you give access to that camera to the internet, somebody from the outside can potentially use that to gain access to your home environment and pivot into your other devices inside that internet that we have. So let's say your house can be compromised. The best way to remediate those concerns is to have the company assets access controls. So you have limitations to install all these applications that would grant that internet accessibility to those devices. You can install printers, but without giving access to the print from anywhere feature. I recently purchased a printer, and the first thing that I want to do is connect to the internet. So I can email, and it would print to that printer from home, regardless of where I was at. I didn't see a need for that feature, and I think that's a exposure for myself and the company. Some people might just bypass it and say, yes, install next. I think we've all been guilty of doing that on installs. Just sure, next, done with the installation.
You mean we're supposed to read those?
We're supposed to read those.
Okay.
So your end user license agreements actually are there for a purpose. But
okay, all right. Well, that's good to know. So I've noticed recently that as I try to install apps on my work computer, that the security administrator has blocked those. So tell me, when it comes to installing new devices or new applications on a device, how much of that is the responsibility of the end user, or is this something that can be centrally managed by our IT department?
I think that's a very loaded question. It has to be a mindset of the organization to be secure. The administrators have the responsibility to limit access to your system, which is a traditional role for the IT department. However, as we move back to our home offices, we have to have leeway to be able to become efficient. Some of us need to print. Some of us need to be able to use virtual conferencing solutions, so you might have to install some of those applications. So you need to have a balance on how to operate. The best approach that we have is to rely on our tools that we have in place to protect the endpoint. So we have stuff like anti-malware solutions, let's call it, any antivirus out there will be doing the same thing. The most important factor, however, is to have it centrally managed, because if you have a computer that goes into a home office and it gets infected by malware and it never reports back, that person might be working at home with an infected computer for 2-3 months, and all the company data that's going through there is being stolen or observed or whatnot by bad actors. So the centralized solutions are a good solution to have there. The direct answer to your question is the IT department is responsible to have safeguards on the system so you can limit the access that you have to the computer, with obviously finding a balance without impacting the business. So we have that as well. And then something else to consider is, because we're away from the office, we lose a lot of the protection that we typically have. Perimeter firewalls. So do we have any way to protect the computer specifically from bad traffic, such as a host-based firewall? Most antivirus solutions out there do have the feature, however, it needs to be configured. So that goes back to the IT department to configure it properly.
Very good. So my next question for you, Jesus, is, I work from home. I've got a Wi-Fi network that everybody in my house uses, right? So my wife, my kids, all 5 of my kids on their various devices that they have, which we're doing our best as good, responsible parents to restrict. So is that something that we need to think about in order to help secure our data? Is accessing work-based information or sensitive data through our home networks?
So from the compliance perspective, regardless of the location, the entity should limit access to data based on necessity. From a being at home perspective, you still need to be cautious as if you were at home or if you're at a coffee house. The data that you have, do you need to have it? As we move to work from home, that doesn't really change the fact that we still need to be cautious with the data. We have multiple devices in a corporate location. We have multiple devices at home. If we all implement best practices to keep those devices safe, the likelihood of having any compromise of data is small. However, if your internet at home has no password to connect to the wireless connection, you are basically opening up to anybody who wants to connect to your internet. Then there's the potential to somebody snooping in your internet traffic. So then we rely on some other tools to make sure that that device is protected, such as I mentioned earlier, endpoint protection, host-based firewalls. But the best approach that you can have is limit the access if you don't need it.
Yeah, good. That's good. Another question for you, Jesus. We work together, as I mentioned, on a lot of cybersecurity consulting engagements, a lot of SOC reports. One trend that I have noted recently, and I don't think this is news to anybody, but I think that businesses are leveraging cloud technology more so than ever. It's a trend that has been in the making for the past decade. I've read recent statistics that the cloud market itself is going to be at $1 trillion here within the next few years. You look at various cloud providers, such as Amazon. Most of us are familiar with Amazon as being an e-commerce and distribution business, one that's thrived and done particularly well in the pandemic. Well, the most profitable segment of Amazon is AWS, which is their cloud segment. Microsoft has one that's very competitive. Salesforce, Alibaba, Google, all these are large cloud providers that businesses are leveraging. So now that we're shifting away from the old-fashioned stand up a server on your internal network, an on-premise solution, and a lot of our data is now being moved to the cloud, does that change the way that we need to approach cybersecurity? Are there best practices we should think about if we're starting to use cloud-based products and move our data away from our premises and onto the cloud?
So the direct answer to that I'll get to in a second. Let me just say that my favorite t-shirt says the cloud is nothing more than somebody else's computer. So as you go to a cloud solution, you do have to identify the responsibilities of the service provider and your responsibilities contractually. Most likely the service providers will give you availability, which means they're promising you that their system's going to be maintain a 99.49 availability, so the likelihood of you having downtime is very remote. That said, going to the cloud maintains the same requirements to configuration. The only difference is you're transferring the risk of maintaining equipment to somebody else. So from a compliance perspective, you still have to do everything that you have to do, regardless of you having servers in the back room in your office or having those servers be virtually hosted at Amazon or Microsoft's infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think, so the way that I've heard it explained, and I think this is frequently the way that we articulate it to our clients, you're able to leverage a lot of infrastructure that's very, it is inherently secure, but it just depends on how you configure it. There are certain things that you can use, like web application firewalls, and the way that you configure those is very important. The way that you configure these buckets of data that are sitting out there, if you're doing that in a secure manner, you can take advantage of some of the infrastructure by these large cloud providers. But there's kind of a line in the sand on what you're responsible for and what they're responsible for. You need to know what you're responsible for so that you can manage your own end of things. It's not a risk that can be outsourced entirely, right?
Correct. AWS, Microsoft, insert brand name here, data center, will provide you infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, which translates to you basically tell them what do you need, and they'll provide it to you. But you still have to configure those components. You can rent a firewall from AWS to protect your application that's hosted and publicly available. If you don't have that protection in front of it and you have a breach, Amazon, the first thing it's going to say to you, or Microsoft, whoever, is going to be, well, you guys didn't protect it. So, and if we've seen that in the industry, we've seen companies, small and large, have data breaches of something that is hosted in the cloud. And of course, they try to point fingers back to the cloud provider. And the first thing they say is, not us. You didn't configure it correctly. And then after doing case studies, the common denominator is misconfigurations.
Yeah. And I think that ties into some of the trends that we've been seeing recently post-pandemic in 2020 on what are some of the vulnerabilities and some of the errors that led to large-scale breaches, one of which is misconfigurations of cloud environments. Again, as you said, Jesus, the cloud provider is going to say, hey, we provided you with what we needed to. It was up to you to configure it correctly. And if you didn't, then a lot of cyber criminals will be able to take advantage of those misconfigurations to then commit an attack and then steal the data. A couple of other things, we have seen a significant increase in phishing schemes. Again, this is not new, but I think one unique aspect of this is that as we're all working from home, we don't have face-to-face interactions as much as we used to. I think this means that we're more susceptible to social engineering schemes, to certain pretexts that cyber criminals may use to try to convince us to give up useful information or to install malware on a device, which could then be used to further an attack. What are some of the things that we can do, Jesus, to help increase our guard, our security posture, and protect against phishing schemes and social engineering schemes?
The best approach that any company can have is training of its employees. You can have millions of dollars worth of infrastructure to protect your environment, but it only takes one person to click on something they shouldn't, and that all goes out the window. So companies that are successful in security have a security mindset throughout the organization. They have processes in place to have checks and balances. The typical phishing scam is, I'm the boss, I'm unavailable because I'm in a meeting, but I need to transfer $100,000 to this account as soon as possible. And if the person who gets that email doesn't have any checks and balances to actually go and proceed and make the transaction, well, then they can make the transaction and the company's out $100,000. But if you have some checks and balances in place to make sure that there's people reviewing these events happening, and then of course, going back to my original statement, if you have security awareness, people trained to recognize these fraudulent approaches, then you have another safeguard to make sure it doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I think we all laugh at some of the older phishing attempts of emails that we receive that are misspelled. We have a Nigerian prince that's in trouble and needs some money. And I think we still get those, but I think what we've seen is the sophistication has improved significantly over recent years. And I think some of these attacks can be quite convincing. And something that you've brought to my attention before in the past, Jesus, is that cyber criminals that are smart can just log on to social media and see what their targets are doing and use that information, leverage it to make an attack quite convincing. So it's really important, I think, for all of us to have our guard up and to be aware, because these types of attacks are prevalent. They don't cost a whole lot of money for the cyber criminals to execute, but it can be very damaging when they're successful. Another question I have for you, and this frankly was a little bit of a surprise to me, is I think we've seen a little bit of an increase and an uptick on IP theft post-pandemic. And, my research has indicated that, part of the idea behind this is that during a period of economic uncertainty, when employees are working from home, they're not sure about the success or failure of their business, their employer, and they think their employment status is in question. They're more inclined to then start massively downloading sensitive data or intellectual property to be used should the worst happen. Are there some tips or some techniques that we can employ to help identify when employees are starting to download a lot of data? Or are there ways that we can prevent that from happening?
The easiest way to prevent this is to have role-based access, where you limit the access of information that an employee can get to based on the job they're performing. There are tools out there that can limit transfer of files. They can alert if there is movement of large data sets. All these technologies require investment in time and money, obviously, to buy these solutions. However, the best approach to come to it is keep access out of people's hands if they don't need to use that data for their work. It's surprising to see how many of our clients have strong postures just by limiting access to the different files that they have in the file shares. They have a file share for accounting, and that is structured to accounts payable, accounts receivable, and only the people who are specific to those jobs will have access to those specific folders. And that's sometimes as a powerful tool and to have a high-end solution. Obviously, those high-end solutions do operate for a reason as a high-end solution, but they also cost what a high-end solution is worth.
Yeah, that's good. One thing I've also noticed, right, circling back to our conversation on cloud technology, it seems that our clients, as well as here at Whitley Penn, that we're being forced to log in through multi-factor authentication. How important is this if you're logging into a cloud environment? Is this something that all of us need to start taking advantage of? Or is it just something that's really annoying that we're going to have to deal with for many years to come?
Well, it is really annoying, and we're going to have to deal with it for the years to come. But there's a reason why it's there. It is a very secure way to validate that you are indeed the person who is trying to log into the system. Unfortunately, passwords are a little bit dated in the way that they operate, and there's bad guys who are constantly trying to steal your password either by phishing emails or by baiting you into clicking a bad software link, and just with the sole intent to steal your password. Coffee houses, the sole purpose of somebody pretending to be the coffee house internet is to steal passwords. The benefit of having multi-factor authentication is that if somebody does happen to get access to your password, when you're trying to log into the system, you have to input either a PIN or a code or push a yes button, this is me. So the bad guy now has to have another insight into your technology, which most likely they're going to move on to a different person to steal data.
And so then from that point forward, then Jesus, I want to bring up another question for you. We've talked about cloud providers, and so I think we've addressed the concept of third-party risk somewhat, right? You mentioned the idea of reviewing your contracts, service level agreements, having a really good handle on what your providers are responsible for and what you're responsible for. What are some other good practices that we can apply to third-party risk management if we're outsourcing any component of our technology, if we're outsourcing to an IT managed service provider, or if we're using software as a service. Are there other things that we can do to ensure that our risks are adequately thought of, that they're addressed and mitigated?
So the best way I can answer that without going into a long-winded response is know what your contract entitles you to, what are your responsibilities, and what are the service provider's responsibilities. I always like to use the example with our clients when we discuss contracts. In the contract, where does it state who can yell at who? If there is some sort of event, if the software you're lending from them goes down, does it state on the contract that you're able to yell at them and say, bring it up? So that's the best approach that I can say for your vendors. Validate responsibilities and with a delineation line of them.
Yeah. And I'd like to add to that also, Jesus, that for certain kinds of third-party providers, there is the concept of a third-party attestation report. We work for a CPA firm, so we perform 60 plus SOC examinations for our clients every year. It doesn't have to be limited to SOC reports. I know that if you store cardholder data, there are PCI, third-party attestation reports. There are other concepts depending on the industry and the type of data that you have. One thing that I would like to encourage all of us to do, though, is ask your vendors for these reports. It's not a silver bullet, right? They're not perfect. It doesn't mean that everything is 100% perfect and secure at the third-party vendors. But what it does do is hold them accountable. So if someone knows that they're going to have an auditor come in at the end of the year and then test everything that they've done for the entire year, it just helps improve their overall awareness. It improves their security posture. It improves their approach to internal controls. In addition, these kinds of reports are pretty informative. So if you want to know what the vendor is doing to protect your data or to protect your environments, it's helpful to know what controls they have in place, what kind of policies they have, who's responsible for performing what. There's also detail on the technology stack that they use as well, so you can get greater insight in how do they run themselves as a company. So I'd like to encourage everyone just to ask, and it's certainly not the most exciting read, but I think just the process of asking is still an important part on keeping our third-party vendors accountable and responsible. Jesus, any parting words of wisdom? So, we've talked about being in a work-from-home model, distributed workforce. There are some changes in the threat landscape that we're seeing this year. Is there anything else that you want everybody to take with them that's going to be useful advice?
I don't have anything else to add except I'm going to echo what I already said. The technology that we have in place is here to help us be safe, but at the end of the day, it's on us to be safe. We are the best tool the organization can have to safeguard our environment, our workplace. So just be mindful of everything that's coming in. We know our business in and out. If something stands out, follow your instinct that it might be suspicious. It's probably because of a reason.
Okay. Thank you for those parting words of wisdom, Jesus. I want to thank everybody for listening. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Whitley Penn Talks, and we hope to talk to you again in the future.